Well, hey, what's up, everybody? Matthew here. Thanks for checking into the channel. We're going to continue on our long-term study of the life and ministry of Jonathan Edwards. I have what I think is the best playlist of Jonathan Edwards-related material on the internet, and that is right here on this YouTube channel. You can go to my playlist and you can check out over 40 videos on the life, the theology, the writings, the significance of Jonathan Edwards. And today we're going to continue that on with what I think is going to be something of a longer video, maybe 35, 40 minutes or so, perhaps even longer, not 100% sure here. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at the revival of 1735. Now, this is the revival that preceded the Great Awakening, which would come just 5 years later. And because this video is going to be a little bit longer, I just want to suggest that maybe you might want to check this out on some of my other formats. So this is going to come out first on YouTube, but I also have the possibility now of sharing a lot of stuff on my Spotify channel. Sometimes I post things on Facebook, and because Spotify kicks it over to Apple Podcasts now, you can listen on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. So if you don't already subscribe to those particular formats, you might want to go over there and do that, because this might be a good video for you to listen to as you're driving on a trip, or perhaps working around the house, or maybe working on the car engine out of the garage. You might want to just turn this one on and listen for a bit here. But we're going to talk today about the revival of 1735. Now, what is an awakening, and why are awakenings so significant? Well, first of all, we could say that awakenings are biblical. They are generally a religious revival in which people come to faith and personal conversion, resulting in lasting life change on a large scale. So when an individual gets converted, we call that a person getting saved or getting born again. Well, if a town experiences that, or a city or a state or even a nation, sometimes even multiple nations, then we call that usually an awakening or a harvest or a revival, or even, as it happened in the 1500s, a reformation. So we see examples of awakenings, for instance, in the kingship of Josiah or the kingship of Hezekiah in the Old Testament, perhaps too in the book of Jonah. Nineveh has a revival under the preaching of Jonah. And so we have seen and experienced many revivals throughout church history. And so Jonathan Edwards was part of that one that we call the Great Awakening. Now, in this video, though, we're not looking at the Great Awakening proper. That would happen in 1740 to 42. But rather what we're going to do is we're going to look at the awakening that took place just 5 years prior, specifically at the Northampton Church. Now, there were other churches involved in this. This is more of a Connecticut River Valley revival, but Edwards' church was right at the heart of it. So let's get into some background about the Northampton Church, all right? It had been around for 80 years by the time this had happened, and we have three pastors that had been the pastor of the church over its history. Eleazar Mather was the founding pastor, followed by Solomon Stoddard, and then ultimately Jonathan Edwards. Now, a couple of anomalies here that are at least interesting to talk about. First, when Stoddard took over after Eleazar Mather died, Stoddard not only took the pulpit of the Northampton Church, but he also moved into the manse and married his widow. So that's kind of interesting. So Stoddard married Eleazar Mather's widow. That's unique. I don't think that happens very often in pastoral life. And then the other uniqueness is that Jonathan Edwards served with Solomon Stoddard for a couple of years as his assistant pastor. And interestingly, Edwards is Solomon Stoddard's grandson. So Stoddard is Edwards' grandfather, to put it that way. This, we are told in Edwards' history of this revival, a faithful narrative on pages 144 to 147. Now, Solomon Stoddard's time at the Northampton Church was certainly interesting enough. Not only did he take the pulpit and the widow of Eleazar Mather, but he was a bit of a controversialist. Now, Stoddard himself would sometimes be called one of the Connecticut River gods, or even the Pope of the Connecticut Valley, because of his outstanding influence. But one thing that Stoddard did is he changed, in a way, the pattern of how baptism and the Lord's Supper work together as sacraments in Reformed congregational churches, which is to say that Stoddard opened the communion table to those who were at least baptized but did not live a scandalous life. And what he didn't do was necessarily require a profession of faith or a conversion story in order to admit people to the Lord's Supper. That's something that Edwards would want to double back on later on in his ministry, and perhaps we'll talk about that. I have done a video, by the way, on Jonathan Edwards' firing, in which case we'll get into that in some detail. Now, during Solomon Stoddard's time at the Northampton Church, there were 5 harvests or awakenings during his ministry. 1680, 1684, 1697, 1713, and then 1719, with those middle three being the most notable of the five awakenings. Okay. One final note on Solomon Stoddard: he died the last day, or the same day that the last ruling elder of the church had died. Okay, so unfortunately, with Stoddard's death, the death of the ruling elders of the church as well. Now, one other thing I find, really compelling here, of course, we say that these guys were Congregationalists, but Solomon Stoddard did found something of like a proto-presbytery. The Hampshire Association was an association of congregational like-minded churches founded by Stoddard. They met twice a year in October. The purpose of it was to make sure that the churches were orthodox in their Reformed theology, to evangelize the heathen, and then for other things like ordination and installation of ministers. Starting in 1732, interestingly enough, they required subscription to the Westminster Confession of Faith. So in my other video where I talk about Edwards and his Presbyterianism, of course, technically he's congregational, but in some ways he's functionally Presbyterian. I do talk a little bit there more about the significance of the Hampshire Association. Okay. Now, Edwards and his grandfather, they were co-pastors together for some time. And these 2 years were 1727 to 1729. Okay, so they're pastor and associate for a while. In 1727, there was an earthquake in which, once again, there was something of a shakeup, spiritually speaking. There was, whenever you have sort of like a disaster, like a flood, it wouldn't be hurricanes here in this part of the country necessarily, a flood or an earthquake or some kind of a tremendous storm, a hailstorm, people were very spiritual in those days, and they often attributed it to the judgment of God trying to do something, wake them up, shake them up. And so there was sort of a mini revival here in 1727 at the time of the earthquake. But later in 1729, when Solomon Stoddard finally died, and he was mid-80s and still preaching up a storm, even in his mid-80s, he had 10 sermons ready to go. At age 85, at the time that he passed away, he was sharp. His mind had never yielded. It was his body that finally gave way. So Stoddard was, something of a very eminent man. Some people said that Solomon Stoddard was the most significant leader, except for perhaps those pastors in Boston, which, being on the coastal city of some significance, would have probably been more important, the Mathers family and so forth. But nevertheless, Stoddard was, as I mentioned, one of the Connecticut River gods, lowercase g, meaning he's extremely significant. So Edwards takes over his church basically at his death. And in 1735, we're going to experience what we're calling here the local revival. Now, if you're keeping track, this would be the sixth harvest that the Northampton congregation is going to experience over time. This is not yet the Great Awakening. Now, some scholars, when they look at the dates of the Great Awakening, they will suggest that it began in 1735. For me, it's more like a tremor, like a precursor to it. So I would say that most compactly, we can date the Great Awakening, to 1740 to 42, which is, interestingly, the seventh harvest. I'm not suggesting there's something really particularly unique about that number 7, but that is a significant number in biblical literature, of course. And then finally, Edwards is going to be fired in 1750, so by this time, most of the revival works are done and over with, though don't forget that America as a whole is not going to be done with revivalism, because there's going to be a series of other awakenings that we're going to call the Second Great Awakening somewhat later on. Now, as a Reformed and rather conservative theologian myself, I would suggest that the Great Awakening of the 1700s is greater than the Second Great Awakening of the later part of the century or the early 1800s. For theological reasons, I think this one is probably the better and the more authentic of the two Great Awakenings. Now, let's talk about the Northampton Church itself, because this is the center of the revival. And Edwards would describe it as a sober but orderly church, but not necessarily of the most happy temper. Edwards himself is not always of the most happy temper either, to be fair. But he would describe, and he does describe the church this way, that they would be high-spirited, difficult, and turbulent. Okay, so that's, if your pastor calls you high-spirited, difficult, and turbulent, it's not exactly a compliment. And part of the biggest problem that Edwards identified in this church is that it had two political parties in it. It had the court and the country party. Now, the court would be more like your haves, and your country would be more like your have-nots. Or if you want to think about it this way, you might think of it as the white collars versus the blue collars. And that sort of tension, that sort of family legacy kind of versus up-and-comer tension was something that did cause some embroiled resentment within the Northampton church. In addition to that, Edwards would often find fault with the morality of the Northampton church, especially in company keeping, bundling, frolicking, and tavern keeping. Now, the first of these list here has to do with young people and, of course, their romantic sort of trysts that all generations have. Company keeping, meaning hanging out with girls in times and places that it might not be appropriate. Bundling, as you've probably seen in the movie The Patriot, is when parents would actually permit their young people to sometimes even stay together in the same room. Frolicking is basically just traipsing around the town, getting into trouble, throwing stones and throwing eggs and rocks and, all that kind of stuff. And then tavern keeping is basically, drinking too much beer at the tavern or what have you. The same kinds of sins that we have in our day, the same kinds of sins that Edwards had in his day. Now, there was one notable moment back in the times of Solomon Stoddard when the church actually did have a fist fight out in the churchyard. But I mean, honestly, the reason I bring that up is because it's, obviously a fight's not good. It's pretty bad. But it was years ago, and that was like the worst moment in the church's history. So when Edwards describes it as, like morally not great, you do have to keep in mind the context that there was nothing like transgenderism or homosexuality being approved of in society, those kinds of, ultra sodomite type sins that we have in today's culture. I'm sure those things were there. I'm sure they were there, but they were certainly not approved in terms of like social acceptance. Okay, so just keep it in mind. All right, now let's talk about that sixth harvest, because the Great Awakening is going to come later, but it was preceded by a significant precursor, which would be the sixth harvest. This would be the 1734-35 regional revival. What happened and how did it come about? Well, obviously a revival is a work of God. There's nothing that humankind can do to create revivals, which is why I prefer the first Great Awakening to the second Great Awakening, because the second Great Awakening was in some sense manufactured. Okay. Now, the first one though, what happened? Well, there was a couple of sudden deaths in the town. A single man died and a young married woman died in close sequence. Their deaths were unrelated, but they were significant enough that it shook the church. The church was in a grieving mood. The church had been very upset by young people dying. It was and still is very upsetting when we see young people in their teens or their 20s die. To have it happen twice in a row in brief succession is definitely a hard blow as far as that church's congregational life should go. Well, what Edwards does is he preaches a sermon on Psalm 95 and 6 on the brevity of life, the fact that life comes and goes and it's short, it's powerful, it's brief, it's beautiful. And the point of life is, of course, to glorify God, enjoy Him forever, and make sure above all things that you're converted. Well, that sermon actually hit the town pretty hard, and it really began to be that spark that would later burst into flames at the time of the awakening. Now, later, though, Edwards would also likewise preach a series on justification by faith. Now, we point that out because that's the very same doctrine that Martin Luther preached in the 1500s that likewise resulted in the Reformation. So that's hugely significant. So the church then, the Northampton church, actually swells from 300 to 600 members, and Edwards estimates that about 300 people in the local town got saved. So that's significant. Moreover, and make of this what you will, Edwards says there was no illnesses in the church for many Sabbaths. I just find that interesting. That's God apparently gave them not only a season of spiritual health, but a significant season of very physical health too, as they did not get sick for several weeks or months. I mean, again, make of that what you will. But Edwards is moved by this, and what happens is he writes his first major book, which is called A Faithful Narrative. It's not particularly long, but it is a detailed description of what happened in this sixth harvest, or the precursor to the Great Awakening. It's a tremendous book, I think, because it's so terribly encouraging. It's a wonderful book about what God can do with a church or a town. So if you're interested in revival or revivalism, you might want to check this out. Now, as a consequence of this, Edwards becomes something of an expert on revivalism internationally. Not only did Edwards, quote unquote, lead his church through this period, but also he writes the story of it, which is going to be picked up and reprinted in a number of different ways and times, including in Europe, which does put Edwards on the map and makes him something of a significant figure of that pre-First Great Awakening time. Unfortunately, though, it's all going to end with the suicide of Edwards' uncle, a man by the name of Joseph Hawley, who ends up slitting his neck. Now, we'll talk more about that in just a second, but let's look at some of the good news here. Edwards writes in A Faithful Narrative, "There was scarcely a single person in the town, either old or young, that was left unconcerned about the great things of the eternal world. Those that were wont to be the vainest and loosest, and those that had been the most disposed to think and speak slightly of vital and experimental religion, were now generally subject to great awakenings." There's the phrase. "And the work of conversion was carried on in a most astonishing manner, and increased more and more. Souls did, as it were, come by flocks to Jesus Christ. From day to day, for many months together, many might be seen evident instances of sinners brought out of darkness into marvelous light, delivered out of an horrible pit from the miry clay, and set upon a rock with a new song of praise to God in their mouths." Now, he's obviously glossing a couple of texts there, 1 Peter and Psalm 40. But that's what Edwards says happened in the local church in Northampton. He goes on, "This work of God, as it was carried on and the number of true saints multiplied, soon made a glorious alteration to the town, so that in the spring and summer following, 1735, the town seemed to be full of joy and yet full of distress, as it was then. There were remarkable tokens of God's presence in almost every house. It was a time of joy in families on account of salvations being brought unto them, parents rejoicing over their children as newborn." Lost my place. "Husbands over their wives, wives over their husbands. The goings on of God were then seen in his sanctuary. God's day was a delight. His tabernacles were amiable." Edwards says, "Our public assemblies were then beautiful. The congregation was alive in God's service, everyone earnestly intent on public worship, every hearer eager to drink in the words of the minister as they came from his mouth. The assembly in general were from time to time in tears while the word was preached." Wouldn't that be awesome if, as the pastor preaches the word, people were moved to tears, weeping, sorrow, distress, others with joy and love, others with pity and concern for the souls of their neighbors. Okay, so that is kind of the spiritual mood or the spiritual mode that God put the town in during this time. Edwards says here, another long quote, I won't read the whole thing. "Our public praises were then greatly enlivened. God was then served, and our psalmody in some measure in the beauty of holiness. It's been observable that there has been a scarce any part of divine worship wherein good men amongst us have grace so drawn that their hearts would be filled up in the ways of God in singing his praises." You know a church is on fire for the Lord when the men and the teens and the children and the women are all gloriously singing the psalms to God. Now, at this point, Edwards' church is a psalm-only singing congregation. Later in the main awakening, they're going to begin to sing some hymns as well. But at this point, they're only singing the psalms as a congregation. So Edwards' church is actually going to change positions on that during the awakening time. The point here being, though, that those churches that truly love the Lord and are on fire for his glory do sing with enlivened hearts, okay? So as we look at the town, and particularly the townspeople, the church, what can we say then about the responses among the awakened? Well, first, there's pretty evidently here a sense of conviction. God, as he is pouring out his Spirit, convicts people of their sin. He causes them to then dread the judgment, and Edwards is going to sort of detail these kinds of, subjective experiences in his work, A Faithful Narrative, they're going to then go through what is sometimes called legal terrors. Now, legal terrors in the sort of Puritan context is the idea that you try to please God with your life. You say, oh, I'm going to straighten myself up. I'm going to do better. I'm going to obey the Ten Commandments, etc. But rather than being encouraged by your own attempts to please God, rather you find that the law of God is terrifying, because the more you try to obey it, the more you realize you can't. And so that puts people in a particular distemper, because you're going to need a savior. If you can't save yourself by your good moral action, if you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, if you can't do better and improve, then what are you going to do? Well, that's when the breakthrough happens. So conviction, dread, and legal terrors leads then to light, freedom, joy, and ecstasy as Christ comes into the heart, basically dominating the life, filling your heart with joy, freedom, forgiveness, a sense of renewed urgency, mission, zeal, love for God, love for neighbor, etc. Okay, so you can't get here to light, freedom, joy, and ecstasy without first going through conviction, dread, and legal terrors. And so the first Great Awakening does stress the depravity of sin, because you're saved out of something. What are you saved out of? You're saved out of your sin, death, hell, judgment, and into light, freedom, forgiveness, and reconciliation with God. So Edwards is going to then describe this as something like the response that his people went through. Now, as Edwards writes this particular book, A Faithful Narrative, he's going to give some examples of people that were converted. You can't just say a ton of people came to Christ. You got to mention a few of them in particular. And so what Edwards does is he gives two examples of people that he believes were legitimately saved from his congregation. The first is Abigail Hutchinson, and the second is Phoebe Bartlett. Let's talk for just a bit about each one of them. Abigail Hutchinson was a young woman who was dying. She had a terminal illness. We don't really know what it was. Could have been tuberculosis, could have been cancer, could have been some other virus or something like that. At least I don't know what it was, or maybe I'm forgetting. But this woman was pretty sure to die. But even as she's in physically, bodily suffering pain, yet nevertheless, she is experiencing the thralls of spiritual ecstasy and having her sin be forgiven, and knowing, coming into assurance that she's saved by Christ. Edwards writes, the same week she died, when she was in a distressing circumstance as to her body, some of the neighbors that came to see her asked if she was willing to die. She replied that she was quite willing either to live or die. She was always willing to be in pain. She was willing to be so always as she was then, that if it was the will of God, she willed what God willed. They asked her whether she was willing to die that night. She said yes, if it be God's will. And she seemed to speak with all that perfect composure of spirit, and with such a cheerful, pleasant countenance that it filled them all with admiration. So the point here is that Abigail Hutchinson died with something of a saintly heart disposition, ready to go to the Lord, ready to be in eternity, knowing that her sin has been taken away from her, and experiencing again the thralls of the forgiveness, grace, mercy, and peace that salvation offers us in Christ. Now, the second notable convert that Edwards gives by way of example is kind of interesting, because this is Phoebe Bartlett, who's only 3 years old. Now, many people would say, well, 3 is a little bit too young to be converted. But Edwards would say, hold on a second, because John the Baptist leapt in the womb, right? Remember that story from the earlier part of Luke's gospel, where Elizabeth and Mary come into contact, and they're both pregnant, one with Jesus, the other with John the Baptist. And John the Baptist leaps in the womb in the presence of Christ. Well, Edwards believes that even a young person can have a dynamic spiritual experience, and so he details the story of the conversion of Phoebe Bartlett. He says this, "Then the child spoke again and said, 'I love God.' Her mother asked her how well she loved God, whether she loved God better than her father and mother, and she said, 'Yes.' Then she asked whether she loved God better than her sister Rachel. She said, 'Yes, better than anything.' Then her elder sister, referring to her, saying she could find God now, asked her where she could find God, and she answered, 'In heaven.' 'Why?' she said. 'Have you been to heaven?' 'No,' said the child. By this it seems not to have been any imagination of anything seen with bodily eyes that she called God when she said, 'I can find God now.'" In other words, this child has this experience of the infilling of God's presence in her heart. And adults are trying to draw out, what are you What are you describing? What are you feeling? What emotions are you going through? And Phoebe Bartlett, at 3 years old, keeps trying to describe with her limited vocabulary how it is that God has come into her heart and she feels it and knows it. Now, Edwards would say this is a true conversion. Other people would be a little bit more skeptical and they would say, I don't know about that. I mean, maybe she's just caught up in the emotionalism of the revival. But Edwards believes that this is a credible profession of faith. Okay. So how then did the sixth harvest come to an end? Well, unfortunately, as many good things must come to an end, Edwards says this: in the latter part of May, it began to be very sensible that the Spirit of God was gradually withdrawing from us. And after this time, Satan seemed to be more let loose and raged in a dreadful manner. The first instance wherein it appeared was a person's putting an end to his own life by cutting his throat. Now, Edwards is talking about his uncle here, Joseph Hawley, who did unfortunately kill himself by way of a very tragic suicide. Okay, this marks the end of the sixth harvest and the end of the local revival. He says, though, God has so ordered the manner of the work in many respects, and very signally, remarkably, to show it to be his own particular and immediate work, and to secure the glory of it wholly to his almighty power and sovereign grace. In other words, both the beginning and the end of the revival are in God's time. Now, unfortunately, the suicide of Joseph Hawley does seem to be something like a spiritual and satanic attack, because it wasn't just Joseph Hawley that began to be attacked so demonstrably by the evil one, but rather a number of people also felt similar temptations towards suicidality. So Edwards writes this in A Faithful Narrative. After this, multitudes in this and other towns seemed to have it strongly suggested to him and pressed upon him to do as this person had done. And many that seemed to be under no melancholy, some pious persons that had no special darkness or doubts about the goodness of their state, nor were under any special trouble or concern of mind about anything spiritual or temporal, had it urged upon them as if somebody had spoken to them, cut your own throat. So this is terrible because, not only is there maybe that sort of when something tragic happens, there's kind of that copycat syndrome where other people get pulled into it. We see this, for instance, in certain tragedies in our nation. But there seems to be more to it than that. And Edwards would say basically what was happening is that the town itself came under a demonic and satanic attack, even as God, who is sovereign over all things, is withdrawing his spirit, and therefore the end of the revival seems to come. Okay, now, I've been mentioning and stressing in this video that this is the precursor revival to the Great Awakening. So what happened between the local revival and the Great Awakening to come? Well, two things that are very significant. First, Edwards himself in 1737 is going to have a spiritually ecstatic experience in the woods where he goes out typically to walk or to ride his horse. He would do this kind of as like a stress relief, just kind of get out and stretch the legs, chop some wood, get out, in the trees and be alone a little bit for prayer. He has essentially what is like a theophanic or epiphanic epiphany sort of experience where he believes he's come into the presence of Christ. And this is a dramatic experience for Edwards that he's never going to forget. And it is going to change, in some sense, his own heart. But then also in March, a little bit later, notice same year here, 1737, the gallery of the Northampton Church collapses. So you have sort of this striated seating, upper floor, lower floor, right? The upper gallery, the lower gallery of people as they would attend worship in church. The upper gallery collapses on the lower, and you would think, and I would have thought, and they thought, that a number of people would have been killed or maimed or harmed or damaged. But Edwards reports that not one bone was broken. The most amazing instance of divine preservation that perhaps was ever known in this land. Not one person was harmed or killed in this church gallery collapse. Okay, so these two things are going to happen between the time of the revivals. Now later then, of course, we are going to get into what would actually become the Great Awakening. And by this, again, we're referring to primarily the year 1740 to 42. Why do we call this revival great? Well, we call it great for a couple of reasons. First, all of the colonies were affected. Nearly every church. I'm not saying every church, but most churches were affected in one way or the other. Either they're going to receive this revival or they're not going to receive it. But it is going to affect every Protestant denomination in the colonies or the Americas. Now then, there weren't as many denominations as there are today, okay? But you did have your Congregationalists, you did have your Presbyterians, you did have your Anglicans, you did have your Nonconformists, Independents, Baptists, and so forth. Pretty much all the denominations are going to experience something like this awakening. And this likewise is going to influence not only the colonies here in America, but England, Scotland, Ireland, etc., as Europe is going to be looking on at what their strange American younger cousins are doing, okay? During this Great Awakening, of course, you have two major characters on the scene. You have Jonathan Edwards, the subject of this video and all of my other videos on this playlist, as well as you have George Whitefield, who is an itinerant Anglican revival preacher. Both of these are going to be important. Edwards as the diagnostician and the theologian, George Whitefield being the primary preacher and evangelist of the awakenings, okay? Did they ever connect? Yes, they did. In fact, Edwards would write Whitefield a wonderful letter, which you can read in Works of Edwards, volume 16, page 79, where Edwards invites Whitefield to his church. He's going to come. Whitefield comes to Edwards' church. He's going to preach some sermons. Edwards is going to weep. He's going to even come to his house for some family devotions. Whitefield is deeply impressed by Edwards' family and his marriage even. Whitefield not married. He was a single man at that time, but he's going to really be impressed by Edwards' family and marriage. And then later, though they had a wonderful visit here, Edwards and Whitefield are going to have some bit of tensions a little bit later as they're going to come into some mild disagreement about impressions. And I do have a video about Edwards and Whitefield's falling out about what impressions are. Basically, if you come from a charismatic background, you may already know it's something like words of knowledge or claims that God guided directly or told you what to do personally, those sorts of things. Whitefield is for them, Edwards is against them, so that's going to be some tension there. Now, we're going to wrap up here in a few minutes, but I wanted to mention this. In the preface to Edwards' work, Distinguishing Marks, about which see below, more on that in just a moment, William Cooper writes what he believes is the key to this awakening here. He says, "A large number of preachers have appeared among us to whom God has given such a large measure of the Spirit that we're ready sometimes to apply to them the very character of a Barnabas." He says, "They preach the gospel of grace from place to place with uncommon zeal and assiduity. The doctrines they insist on are the doctrines of the Reformation, under the influence whereof the power of godliness so flourished in the last century. The points on which their preaching mainly turns are those important ones of man's guilt, corruption, impotence, supernatural regeneration of the Spirit of God, free justification," so there again is that theme of justification, "by faith in the righteousness of Christ, the marks of the new birth," etc. So William Cooper is basically going to say one of the things that makes this awakening so interesting is how God seems to have raised up men who were ready to preach with fire and zeal the same doctrines that resulted in the great period of the Reformation in the 1500s, okay? Final thing we're going to do here in this video, I do want to mention another short work of Edwards called The Distinguishing Marks, and this is probably Edwards's, well, it's one of my favorite Edwardsian works on the Great Awakening. Edwards says, as it relates to revivals, certainly Satan can imitate. And that was one claim that a lot of people made that were anti-revivalists. They said, it's probably satanic manipulation. People just caught up in enthusiasm, people being psychologically influenced and so forth. Edwards says, yeah, that's probably part of it. Sure, definitely Satan wants to imitate, mock, and diminish. But he says, sometimes it's hard to tell. And Edwards gives 9 what he calls uncertain signs of a work of God. In other words, if you see these things, it might be real, it might not. Okay? Extraordinary events, the fact that something amazing is happening, could be God, could be Satan. Bodily effects, people falling down, shaking, raising their hands, making a clamor, maybe. Great ado, a lot of discussion about it, controversy, whatever. Impressions on the imagination, social pressure to imitate, irregularities, delusions, error, scandal, fiery preaching. Just the fact that there's error and scandal doesn't mean it's satanic necessarily. Could be. I mean, obviously error and scandal are satanic, but, Satan would also want to try to defame something real too, though, right? So the fact that there is error doesn't necessarily show that God isn't working, okay? Because God might be working tremendously. Satan just wants to mock it. Even fiery preaching, that could be something that could be kind of ginned up by the machinations of man. So Edwards says these things, and let's just go back and look at that list again just for a second. These 9 things here don't prove that a revival is real or that it's not real. But Edwards does say that there are 5 marks that he calls distinguishing marks that are only legitimate signs of the Spirit of God. The Satan would never manufacture these, okay? Love of Christ, hatred of sin, love of Scripture, love of the truth, love of God and man. If you have these 4 loves in your heart and that one hatred, the hatred of sin, especially your own sin, key thought, then Edwards says, yeah, that's a work of the Spirit. Because these things God does, but Satan would never, ever want to manipulate these. Why would Satan cause people to love Scripture? He wouldn't. Why would Satan cause people to love Christ? He wouldn't. Why would Satan cause people to hate sin, especially their own sin? He wouldn't. These things, when you find them in your life, or perhaps in the lives of the people around you, or in your town, in your church, in your nation, these are distinguishing marks that God is truly in the midst. Okay? And Edwards gives just kind of a final warning here that if you want to ruin it all, if you want to see it all come to a fiery collapse, then be proud. Be proud of yourself, because pride is the revitalization killer. Pride is a revival awakening killer. He says pride is the worst viper in the heart. It's the first sin that ever entered into the universe. Lies lowest of all, the foundation of the whole building of sin. It's the most secret, deceitful, unsearchable in its ways of working. It's ready to mix with everything. Nothing is so hateful to God, contrary to the spirit of the gospel, or so dangerous of consequence. There's no one sin that does so much let in the devil in the hearts of the saints and expose them to his delusions. Edwards says, I've seen pride in many instances, and even in eminent saints. The devil has come in at this door presently after some imminent experience and extraordinary communion with God, and woefully deluded and led them astray. And on he goes. So pride, Edwards says, is the great danger that we have to be aware of. Pride will ruin everything. And finally, what can we say about this? Well, Edwards says, what we experienced was real. It was a real movement of the Spirit of God. Yes, there were some things that happened that were, lamentable, but that's what you would expect in a real revival. Real revivals would be countered by Satan, and yet nevertheless, the Spirit of God would definitely work in dramatic ways as well. Okay? Well, that's it for this video. I hope you appreciated that overview of the 1735 revival. And if you're interested in Jonathan Edwards' studies, I want to just mention to you that this playlist on my YouTube channel has 40 long studies on Edwards and his life and his significance, so you might want to go check that out. Okay, that's it for today. Love you lots. Talk to you later.